On the evening of October 17th, 2023, two gunshots echoed through a quiet California suburb. When police arrived at 2847 Oakmont Drive, they found a decorated war hero sitting motionless on his bedroom floor. In his hand, a service weapon. At his feet, two bodies. But this wasn't a home invasion. This was something far more devastating. The neighbors heard it first. Mrs. Patterson from next door was watching the evening news when the sharp crack of gunfire cut through the October air. 2 shots, she told police later. Then nothing. Just this terrible silence that seemed to go on forever. Detective Destiny had seen her share of crime scenes in 23 years on the force, but when she walked into that bedroom, something felt different. The man sitting on the floor wasn't running, wasn't making excuses, wasn't even crying. He just sat there, staring at what he'd done, and when they asked him why, he said 7 words that would haunt everyone who heard them. They betrayed me, both of them. What could drive a man who spent 27 years protecting his country to commit an act that would destroy everything he believed in? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who these people really were before that terrible night changed everything. If you're new here and stories like this matter to you, stories that dig deep into the human condition and ask the hard questions, hit that subscribe button now. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to look at the darkness and try to understand it. Linda Cooper Holloway was an artist who painted families. Her gallery owner, Margaret Chen, still gets emotional talking about Linda's work. She had this gift, Margaret says. She could capture something in people's faces, this hope, this connection. She painted what she believed love should look like. Linda was born in 1982, in Fremont, California, to parents who seemed like they'd stepped out of one of her paintings. Her mother, Anita, was a Stanford-educated nurse who'd immigrated from India with dreams bigger than the small town she'd left behind. Her father, Daniel, was an Irish-American former athlete who coached high school football and believed Sunday games were sacred family time. Growing up, Linda lived between 2 worlds. Summers meant trips to visit her grandparents, where she'd spend hours sketching the chaos and color of the street. The rest of the year was California suburbia, football games, art classes, and family dinners, where her parents debated everything from politics to philosophy, while Linda absorbed it all. She was brilliant in that rare way that combines logic with creativity. At UC Berkeley, studying fine arts and visual communication, her professors noticed something special. Linda understood human connection at a molecular level. Dr. Sarah Williams remembers. She'd say that emotion and logic weren't opposites, they were partners. That philosophy showed up in everything she created. But Linda's story doesn't make sense without understanding the man who would eventually destroy it all. James Holloway was 55 years old when police arrested him that October night. Major James Holloway, retired, 101st Airborne Division, 27 years of service across Iraq and Afghanistan. A man who'd built his entire life on 3 principles: duty, loyalty, and love. He grew up in a working-class black family where his father worked double shifts at the factory and his mother taught elementary school. James was the quiet kid who listened more than he spoke, who spent Friday nights at the library while other kids were at parties. He was brilliant, especially in math and physics, but college seemed like a luxury his family couldn't afford. The Army recruiter who visited his high school in 1989 made promises that sounded like salvation, education, structure, purpose. James enlisted not because he wanted to fight wars, but because he wanted to build something better for himself. And he did. Bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, master's in military leadership and strategy. He rose through the ranks not because he was the loudest or the most aggressive, but because he was the one who stayed calm when everything went to hell. Holloway doesn't panic, his commanding officer noted in an early evaluation. He calculates. That's who James was, a man who approached life like a military operation, every decision measured, every risk assessed, every outcome planned for. He treated his subordinates like equals, volunteered for the dangerous missions, and carried the weight of every soldier he couldn't save. But here's what made James different from a lot of career military men. He had a philosopher's mind trapped in a warrior's body. The families he couldn't protect in Iraq and Afghanistan haunted him more than any medal could heal. The Veterans Art Exhibition was held at a gallery in San Francisco's Mission District. Linda had volunteered because she believed art could heal trauma, a philosophy that would prove tragically ironic. James was there reluctantly, invited to speak about resilience by an organization that helped veterans transition to civilian life. Picture this: Linda, 27 years old, standing in front of a painting of a soldier's homecoming. She's studying the brushstrokes, the way the artist captured longing in the wife's posture, hope in the children's faces. James approaches, not to make conversation, but because he recognizes something in the painting, the weight of absence, the complexity of return. "It's beautiful," Linda says without looking away from the canvas. "It's honest," James replies, and something in his voice makes her turn. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. They talked about art and war, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of loss, about whether healing is possible or if we just learn to carry our wounds more gracefully. Linda saw in James something her artistic eye had been searching for: strength that wasn't performed, vulnerability that wasn't weakness. James saw in Linda something his soldier's heart had given up, hoping for someone who could look at his scars and see beauty instead of damage. The courtship was careful, respectful. James understood that Linda's parents had raised a daughter who deserved better than a man who might not come home from his next deployment. But love, real love, doesn't follow strategic plans. Daniel and Anita Cooper watched their daughter fall for this quiet soldier and saw something they hadn't expected. James didn't just love Linda, he revered her. He treated her like she was made of light, and maybe that should have been a warning sign. Putting someone on a pedestal leaves a long way to fall. The wedding was small, intimate. Both families, a few close friends, and Derek Miles giving that best man speech about brotherhood and loyalty that everyone would remember later for all the wrong reasons. But here's where the story gets complicated. Derek Miles wasn't a villain in 2009. He was a 37-year-old man who'd never found love himself, but believed in it enough to celebrate his best friend's happiness. He owned an auto shop in Savannah, had steady customers who trusted him with their cars and their stories. He was the guy who showed up when you needed help moving, who remembered your birthday, who never asked for anything in return. When James deployed to Afghanistan in 2010, leaving behind a pregnant wife, Derek's promise to be the man around the house seemed like exactly what it was supposed to be: friendship in action. And maybe it started that way. Maybe Derek really did intend to just fix the leaky faucet and mow the lawn and be the uncle figure James couldn't be while he was overseas. Maybe Linda really did just need help with the practical things that pile up when you're pregnant and alone. But intentions and outcomes are different things, aren't they? If this story is making you think about the relationships in your own life, the friends you trust, the boundaries you maintain, the promises you make, then you're getting it. And if you're getting it, hit that subscribe button, because we need more people willing to look at these hard truths. Linda's first pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted all day, complications that required bed rest, the kind of isolation that makes you grateful for any friendly face. Derek was there for the grocery runs, the doctor's appointments James couldn't attend via satellite phone, the middle of the night panic when something felt wrong. When James called from Afghanistan to check on his wife, Derek would be in the background fixing something, helping with something, being useful in ways James couldn't be from 8,000 miles away. "How's Derek doing?" James would ask, and Linda would say, "He's been a godsend," and James would feel that particular military gratitude for the people who take care of your family when you can't. Their son was born in March 2011. James got the news during a mission briefing, and his commanding officer later said it was the first time he'd ever seen Major Holloway lose his composure. Not from enemy fire or casualties, but from joy he couldn't share in person. Derek was at the hospital. He held James's son before James did. He was in the delivery room photos that James would treasure, not knowing they documented the beginning of his betrayal. When James came home from that deployment, everything seemed perfect. His wife, his son, his best friend who'd kept his promise to watch over them. The three adults fell into an easy rhythm: family dinners where Derek was always welcome, weekend barbecues where neighbors assumed he was Linda's brother, holiday celebrations where he was as much a part of the tradition as anyone. Their daughter was born in 2013, And this time James was home. He held her first, cut the umbilical cord, felt that overwhelming love that makes you understand why people fight wars to protect moments like this. But the deployments continued, because that's what military families do. They serve, they sacrifice, they trust that the people they leave behind will honor that sacrifice. 2014 brought another deployment to Iraq. 2017 meant Afghanistan again. Each time, the same conversation, watch over them. The same promise, I'll be the man around the house. The same gratitude when James returned to find his family safe and happy. Except they weren't just safe and happy. They were bonded to Derek in ways that went deeper than friendship, deeper than help with household repairs. The children called him Uncle Derek, but they ran to him with scraped knees and bad dreams. Teachers at school events assumed he was co-parenting. Neighbors saw him at birthday parties and school plays and soccer games, always there when James was deployed, sometimes there even when James was home. And Linda? Linda was living a double life that she'd convinced herself was necessary, justified, maybe even noble. She was keeping the family together, wasn't she? She was making sure the children had a father figure, making sure they didn't feel abandoned every time James left for another deployment. But by 2015, something had changed in her paintings. Margaret Chen, her gallery owner, noticed it first. Linda's work got darker, she remembers. She was still painting families, but there were shadows now, cages, people looking in different directions. One painting from that period shows a woman standing between two doors, one leading to sunlight, one leading to darkness. Both doors are open. The woman's face is turned away from the viewer, so you can't see which way she's looking. Linda titled it, Choice. James saw the painting when he came home from his 2017 deployment, and he asked Linda what it meant. She said it was about the choices we make when we think no one is watching, about how every decision creates the person we become. James thought it was beautiful. He thought it showed his wife's artistic growth, her deepening understanding of human nature. He had no idea she was painting her confession. The truth is, by 2015, Linda and Derek weren't just friends helping each other through James's absences. They were living as a family, raising children together, sharing a life that James only glimpsed during his brief returns home. And those children? The son born in 2011 and the daughter born in 2013? They were growing up with a father figure who was there for every milestone, every crisis, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon when they needed help with homework or wanted someone to throw a baseball in the backyard. James was their father on paper, in photos, in the stories Linda told them about his service and sacrifice. But Derek was their father in practice, in presence, in the 1,000 small moments that actually build a childhood. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It wasn't just sexual. It was existential, a complete rewriting of what family meant, what fatherhood meant, what love meant. And James had no idea. In March 2023, after 27 years of service, James Holloway submitted his retirement papers. He was finally coming home, for good. He thought he was returning to his family. He had no idea he was walking into someone else's life. The affair didn't start with a kiss or a moment of passion. It started with exhaustion. Derek had been coming by more often, not just for the big things, the broken garage door, the leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, but for the small ones too. Groceries when Linda was too tired to shop, a cup of coffee when the pregnancy insomnia hit at 2 a.m. and she couldn't face being alone with her thoughts. I became someone I didn't recognize, Linda would later tell her therapist. Not all at once, but piece by piece, choice by choice, until I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. The first boundary crossed wasn't physical, it was emotional. A conversation that went too deep, lasted too long, revealed too much. Derek, talking about the loneliness of never finding someone to build a life with. Linda admitting that sometimes she felt more like a military wife than James's wife married to his duty, his honor, his absence. He's never here, she said one night when Derek found her crying over a sink full of dishes she was too pregnant and too tired to wash. You're more present in my children's lives than their own father. And Derek, who'd spent 2 years watching his best friend's wife struggle alone, who'd fallen in love with her resilience and her kindness and the way she painted hope even when she couldn't feel it, said the words that changed everything. Maybe that means something. Here's what makes this story so devastating. Linda never stopped loving James. She loved his integrity, his sacrifice, his unwavering belief in doing the right thing. But love and need are different things, and she needed what Derek offered: presence, consistency, the ordinary intimacy of shared daily life. If you're watching this and thinking about the complexity of human relationships, about how good people can make terrible choices, then you understand why this story matters. Hit that like button if you're still with me, because we're about to go deeper into the psychology of deception. The second pregnancy created the perfect cover. When Linda gave birth in February 2013, James was home on leave. The timing worked. The baby looked like Linda: dark hair, her nose, her stubborn chin. James held his daughter and felt that overwhelming love that makes everything else disappear. He never questioned the paternity. Why would he? This was his wife, his best friend, his family. The possibility of betrayal wasn't even in his vocabulary. But Derek knew. Linda knew. And they made a choice that would poison the next decade of their lives. They decided to let James believe. "We told ourselves we were protecting him," Linda later wrote in her journal, pages that investigators would find after the shooting. "We told ourselves it was kinder this way, but really we were protecting ourselves. We were cowards." The conspiracy of silence deepened with every passing month. School enrollment forms where Linda listed James as the father, medical appointments where she gave James's family history to doctors, birthday parties where James's parents sent gifts to grandchildren who weren't genetically theirs. And the children? They grew up in a world where Uncle Derek was more father than their actual father, but they were too young to understand the implications. They just knew that Derek was the one who taught them to ride bikes, who showed up to school plays, who knew their friends' names and their favorite foods and the specific way they liked their bedtime stories told. From 2012 to 2023, Linda and Derek lived a double life that required constant performance. When James was home, brief leaves, holiday visits, the spaces between deployments, they had to pretend to be just friends. Linda had to remember to be distant with Derek, to treat him like the helpful family friend he was supposed to be. But when James was deployed, which was most of the time, they lived as a family. Derek had his own key to the house, his clothes in Linda's closet, his name on the emergency contact forms at the children's schools. The community saw it and accepted it because military families are complicated. Teachers assumed Derek was co-parenting during James's deployments. Neighbors figured he was the uncle helping out. Coaches and scout leaders and piano teachers worked with whatever adult showed up, and Derek showed up for everything. "We thought Derek was the uncle," says Mrs. Rodriguez, who taught both children in elementary school. "He came to parent-teacher conferences, signed permission slips, volunteered for field trips. The kids lit up when his truck pulled into the carpool line. I never questioned it because military families make it work however they can. But here's the thing about living a lie for 10 years. It stops feeling like a lie. It becomes your reality." Linda and Derek weren't pretending to be a family anymore. They were a family, with all the ordinary intimacy and shared responsibility that entails. Linda's art during this period tells the story her words couldn't. Paintings of divided houses, of people wearing masks, of children playing in gardens while adults watch from separate windows. Her 2018 series, titled Parallel Lives, showed the same scenes painted twice, once in bright colors, once in shadows. Margaret Chen, her gallery owner, remembers asking Linda about the darker themes. She said she was exploring the idea that we all live multiple lives simultaneously. The life others see, the life we live in private, the life we wish we were living. I thought it was profound. I didn't realize it was autobiography. James noticed changes too, but he interpreted them through the lens of military life. Linda seemed more independent when he came home from deployments. The children were more attached to routines he wasn't part of. The house felt like it ran perfectly well without him. He attributed it to Linda's strength, to Derek's friendship, to the resilience military families develop. He was proud of how well they'd adapted to his absence. He had no idea they'd adapted by replacing him. In 2018, Linda suggested James consider early retirement. "The kids are getting older," she said. "They need their father home." James was touched by her concern, but he had 3 more years until his pension fully vested, 3 more years of service to complete his mission. "Just 3 more years," he promised. "Then I'm home for good." Linda smiled and said she understood, but her journal from that period reveals her growing panic. How do I tell Derek that James is coming home permanently? How do I tell the children that their real father isn't who they think he is? How do I tell James that the life he's been fighting to protect doesn't actually exist? By 2020, the strain was showing. The pandemic meant James was home more often, and the 3 adults had to navigate a new kind of performance. Derek's visits became awkward, stilted. The children were confused about why Uncle Derek couldn't come over as much. Linda was caught between 2 lives that were becoming impossible to maintain simultaneously. She suggested marriage counseling. James refused, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't see the problem. From his perspective, they had a strong marriage that had survived multiple deployments. They had healthy children, a comfortable home, a best friend who'd proven his loyalty over and over again. "What would we talk about?" James asked. "We're happy." And they were happy, in the moments when the performance felt real. But Linda was drowning in the weight of her deception, and Derek was tired of being a secret, and the children were growing old enough to ask questions about why their family felt different from other families. Linda's paintings from 2021 and 2022 grew increasingly dark. Cages, shadows, people reaching toward each other across impossible distances. One painting showed a woman standing in a house of mirrors, surrounded by infinite reflections of herself, each one slightly different, each one a lie. If you're following this story and recognizing the psychological complexity of long-term deception, you're understanding something important about human nature. We're not built for this kind of sustained dishonesty. It corrodes everything it touches, and if that resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. We need more people willing to examine these difficult truths. But the most devastating part of this story isn't the affair itself. It's what Linda and Derek discovered as the children grew older, as genetic traits became more apparent, as family resemblances emerged in ways that couldn't be ignored. The son born in 2011 had James's hands, his laugh, his way of tilting his head when he was thinking. The daughter born in 2013 had Derek's eyes, his stubborn streak, his talent for fixing things. The betrayal wasn't just romantic, it wasn't just sexual, it was genetic, generational, existential. James had spent over a decade loving, providing for, and building his legacy around children, only one of whom shared his DNA. And still, Linda and Derek said nothing. They told themselves they were protecting James, protecting the children, protecting the life they'd all built together. But really, they were protecting themselves from the consequences of choices they'd made a decade earlier. In March 2023, James submitted his retirement papers. After 27 years of service, he was finally coming home, for good. Linda's journal entry from that day. "He called to tell me the news, so excited, so proud. I'm finally coming home to my family," he said. "But this isn't his family. It never was, and I don't know how to tell him that the life he's been fighting to protect is built on a lie." The countdown had begun. James Holloway was coming home to discover that everything he believed about his life was fiction. May 15th, 2023, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. After 27 years of service, Major James Holloway stood at attention for the last time as an active duty soldier. The retirement ceremony was everything the Army does well: precise, honorable, steeped in tradition. James's commanding officer read his commendations: Bronze Star, Meritorious Service Medal, Combat Action Badge, 27 years of deployments, leadership, sacrifice. Linda sat in the front row with the children, wearing the blue dress James had bought her for their anniversary. She smiled at the right moments, applauded when others did, played the part of the proud military wife she'd been pretending to be for years. Derek was there too, in the back, because of course he was. He'd driven 8 hours from Savannah to attend his best friend's retirement ceremony. The man whose life he'd been living, whose children he'd been raising, whose wife he'd been loving. In his speech, James talked about service and sacrifice, about the men and women who'd served alongside him, about the families who'd supported them all. "I've fought for peace abroad," he said, looking directly at Linda, Now I fight for peace at home." The applause was thunderous. Everyone understood the poetry of it, the warrior coming home, the family reunited, the next chapter beginning. Everyone except Linda, who felt like she was watching her own execution. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Colleagues shook James's hand and talked about his plans for civilian life. He was going to teach the children discipline and structure. He was going to travel with Linda, maybe help her with her art career. He was going to be the husband and father he'd always wanted to be but never had time for. 27 years of putting duty first, he told his former commanding officer. Now my family comes first. Derek congratulated James, hugged him, told him how proud he was. They made plans for Derek to visit once James got settled in California. "Can't wait to spend more time together," Derek said, and he meant it in ways James couldn't understand. The children were excited. They'd never had their father home for more than a few weeks at a time. Now, he was going to be there for everything: school events, weekend activities, ordinary Tuesday afternoons, where nothing special happened, but family was together. Linda smiled and made conversation and pointed out interesting landmarks, but inside she was calculating. How long before James noticed the patterns she and Derek had established? How long before he questioned why the children seemed more comfortable with Derek than with him? How long before he started asking the questions she couldn't answer? They arrived in California on May 18th, 2023. James walked through the house he'd been paying for, but rarely living in, seeing it with fresh eyes. The children's artwork on the refrigerator, family photos on the mantel, but most of them included Derek, the comfortable rhythms of a home that had been functioning perfectly well without him. "It's beautiful," he told Linda. "You've made a real home here." She had. Just not for him. The first few weeks were an adjustment period that everyone expected. James was used to military schedules, early mornings, structured days. Civilian life felt loose, unmoored. He tried to establish routines: family breakfast at 0700, evening walks after dinner, weekend projects that would bring them together. But the children had their own routines, established over years of James's absence. Soccer practice on Tuesdays that Derek had been driving them to, piano lessons on Thursdays that Derek had been paying for, weekend camping trips that Derek had been organizing. "Where's Uncle Derek?" became a constant refrain. When was he coming to visit? Could they call him? Why couldn't he come to dinner anymore? James was patient. He understood that transitions take time, that children need consistency, that Derek had been an important part of their lives during his deployments. He was grateful for his friend's dedication. He had no idea he was trying to reclaim a life that had never been his. By June, the awkwardness was becoming harder to ignore. Derek's visits felt stilted, formal, the easy intimacy James remembered from before his retirement was gone. Linda seemed nervous when Derek was around, like she was performing a role she'd forgotten how to play. And the children, his children, seemed to light up around Derek in ways they never did around James. They ran to Derek when he arrived, clung to him when he left, talked about him constantly when he wasn't there. James told himself it was natural. Derek had been their primary male figure during the deployments. It would take time for the children to adjust to having their real father home. But doubt is like water. It finds the cracks and widens them. If you're watching this and thinking about the psychology of suspicion, about how the mind processes information that doesn't fit our expectations, then you're getting to the heart of what makes this story so tragic. Sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight, but we can't see it because seeing it would destroy everything we believe about our lives. And if that complexity is resonating with you, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories that matter. August brought more observations, text messages on Linda's phone that she quickly closed when James walked into the room, conversations that stopped when he entered, a distance in Linda's eyes that he'd attributed to the stress of his transition, but was starting to feel like something else. September was when James's military training kicked in. 27 years of reading situations, assessing threats, gathering intelligence. He started paying attention in ways he'd never had to pay attention at home. Derek's truck parked 3 blocks away when James went to the grocery store. Linda's unexplained absences that coincided with times when James was out of the house. Phone calls that ended abruptly when he walked into the room. The patterns were there. James just had to decide whether to see them. On September 28th, James made a decision that would seal all their fates. He scheduled an appointment at the VA hospital for October 17th, a routine checkup that would keep him away from home for the entire evening. But he also did something else. He left his phone's location tracking on and told Linda he'd be unreachable for several hours. Then he came home early. The trap was set with military precision. James Holloway, who'd spent 27 years calculating risks and planning operations, was about to discover that the greatest enemy he'd ever faced had been living in his own home. October 17th, 2023, 8:47 p.m. James pulled into his driveway and saw Derek's car parked in front of his house. The house lights were dim except for the bedroom, his bedroom, the room where his children had been conceived, where he'd made love to his wife during brief leaves between deployments. He sat in his car for a moment, engine off, listening to the silence. Part of him wanted to drive away, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen, to preserve the illusion of the life he'd been fighting to protect. But James Holloway was a soldier, and soldiers don't retreat from the truth, no matter how much it might destroy them. He walked to the front door. It was unlocked. Linda had given Derek a key years ago, back when it seemed innocent, back when it was just about helping with household repairs. The house was quiet except for sounds coming from upstairs. Laughter. Linda's laugh, genuine, free, the kind of laughter James hadn't heard from her in years. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, his military training keeping him calm even as his world began to collapse. At the top of the stairs, he could hear voices from behind the bedroom door. His wife's voice, his best friend's voice, intimate, comfortable, like they'd been having this conversation for years, because they had been. James stood outside his own bedroom door, his hand on the knob, knowing that whatever he saw on the other side would end the life he'd built, the identity he'd constructed, the future he'd planned. But he was a soldier, and soldiers complete their missions, even when the mission is their own destruction. He opened the door. What happened in the next 180 seconds would end 2 lives and destroy a third. But even in that moment, James didn't know the full truth. The revelation that would come later would prove that betrayal has depths beyond imagination. October 17th, 2023, 8:50 p.m. The bedroom door opened, and time stopped. James saw his wife and his best friend in his bed, the bed where he'd believed his children were conceived, where he'd made love to Linda during those precious days between deployments, where he'd dreamed of the retirement they'd spend together. 2 shots, military precision. No hesitation once the decision was made. Then silence. Mrs. Patterson from next door had called 911 after hearing the gunshots. 2 shots, then nothing, she told the dispatcher. Just this terrible silence. The crime scene told a story that forensic experts would piece together with clinical precision. Clean shots, no signs of struggle, no evidence of prolonged confrontation. James had opened the door, seen the betrayal, and acted with the same decisive efficiency he'd brought to every military operation. Detective Destiny arrived within minutes. She'd seen domestic violence scenes before, but something about this felt different. The perpetrator sitting calmly beside his victims, no attempt to flee or hide evidence, no emotional breakdown or desperate justifications. "In my 23 years," she later told reporters, "I've never seen someone so completely destroyed by what they'd done, yet so certain they'd had no choice." The children were at a sleepover that night, a mercy that would haunt Linda's parents for years afterward. Daniel and Anita Cooper received the call at 11:30 p.m. from a social worker who explained that their daughter was dead, their son-in-law was in custody, and their grandchildren would need somewhere to stay. "We knew something was wrong," Anita would later tell investigators. Linda had been different the last few years, distant, like she was carrying a secret that was eating her alive. The children were told the next morning by a trauma counselor with their grandparents present. Their mother and Uncle Derek were dead. The man they called Dad had killed them. The initial investigation seemed straightforward. Adultery, betrayal, crime of passion. James's military record worked in his favor. No history of violence, exemplary service, the kind of man who'd never hurt anyone except in defense of his country. But routine protocol in murder cases involving families requires DNA verification to ensure proper placement of surviving children. It's a formality, usually, confirming what everyone already knows. The results came back on November 20th, 2023. Laboratory technician Sarah Kim ran the test twice, certain she'd made an error. One child's DNA, the daughter's, didn't match James Holloway's genetic markers, not even close. It matched Derek Miles. Every moment of fatherhood James had treasured: first steps, bedtime stories, teaching them to ride bikes during his brief leaves, had been built on a lie. The affair hadn't just been romantic, it had been reproductive. James had spent 12 years loving, providing for, and building his legacy around children, only one of whom was truly his. When James's defense attorney delivered the news in county jail, James didn't speak for 3 days. Guards reported that he sat on his bunk, staring at the wall, occasionally shaking his head like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare. It broke something in him that was already broken, the jail psychologist noted. He'd lost his wife, his best friend, his identity as a father, and his entire conception of the past 14 years. Every memory was now contaminated. This wasn't just betrayal, it was psychological annihilation. "How do you explain that to a 12-year-old?" Anita asked the court. "How do you tell children that everything they believed about their family was a performance?" If you're still following this story, if you're grappling with the layers of betrayal and the complexity of human relationships, then you understand why these cases matter. They force us to examine our own lives, our own relationships, our own capacity for both love and deception. Hit that subscribe button if you're committed to exploring these difficult truths with us. The community struggled to process what had happened. Neighbors who'd watched Derek at school events, who'd seen him coaching Little League and attending parent-teacher conferences, had to reconcile their memories with the reality of his relationship to the family. "We all knew he was close to them," said Mrs. Rodriguez, the children's former teacher, "but we thought it was beautiful, this family friend who stepped up when the father was deployed. We had no idea we were watching a decade-long deception." The house at 2847 Oakmont Drive became a crime scene, then an empty monument to shattered lives. Linda's paintings were removed by her parents, dozens of canvases that now read like a confession, a decade of artistic expression documenting the psychological toll of living a lie. Margaret Chen, Linda's gallery owner, donated the paintings to a domestic violence awareness organization. "Linda's art tells the story of what deception does to the human soul," she said. "Maybe someone else can learn from her tragedy." James's military benefits, pension, life insurance, survivor benefits all went to the children. He signed over everything, refusing to profit from a life that had been built on lies. The children would be financially secure, raised by grandparents who loved them, but they'd carry the psychological scars of this betrayal for the rest of their lives. The investigation revealed the full scope of the deception: hotel receipts dating back to 2013, financial records showing money transferred from Linda's account to Derek's business, text messages recovered from Linda's phone that documented years of careful coordination to maintain their secret. One message, sent just days before James's retirement, read, "He's coming home for good. We have to end this." Derek's response, "I can't lose you, and lose the children too." Another, from Linda to Derek after a close call when James almost discovered them, "I'm drowning in this lie, but I don't know how to tell him the truth without destroying everything." The psychological evaluation ordered by the court painted a picture of a man completely undone by betrayal. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic psychologist, noted that James showed signs of complex trauma not just from the discovery of the affair, but from the realization that his entire identity as a husband and father had been fictional. Mr. Holloway built his life on 3 principles: duty, loyalty, and love, Dr. Williams wrote in her report. The discovery that the people he'd served those principles for had been systematically betraying him for over a decade created a psychological break that manifested in violence. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was the collapse of a man's entire worldview. The media coverage was intense but divided. Some portrayed James as a victim, driven to desperate action by unthinkable betrayal. Others focused on Linda and Derek as the real victims, 2 people who'd found love in difficult circumstances and paid for it with their lives. Military support groups rallied around James, seeing in his story the particular vulnerabilities of service families. The long deployments, the strain on marriages, the trust required when you're fighting wars thousands of miles from home. "This could happen to any of us," wrote one veteran on social media. "We serve our country and trust our families to honor that service. When that trust is broken, it breaks us." But victim advocacy groups pushed back, arguing that betrayal, no matter how devastating, doesn't justify murder. "Linda and Derek made choices that hurt James deeply," said domestic violence counselor Rebecca Martinez, "but they didn't deserve to die for those choices." The children, now living with their maternal grandparents, were receiving intensive therapy. The trauma of losing both parents, of learning that their entire family structure had been a lie, of carrying the genetic legacy of a man who'd been killed by the man they'd called father, it was almost too much for young minds to process. "They're resilient," their therapist reported to the court, "but they're also confused, angry, and grieving multiple losses simultaneously. They've lost their mother, their father figure, their sense of family identity, and their trust in the adults who were supposed to protect them." Daniel and Anita Cooper, now in their 70s, found themselves raising children who weren't technically their grandchildren, but whom they loved as if they were. The genetic revelation had been devastating, but it hadn't changed their commitment to the children's welfare. "These kids didn't choose any of this," Daniel told the court during custody proceedings. "They're innocent victims of adult choices. We'll love them and raise them and help them heal, regardless of whose DNA they carry." As James sat in county jail awaiting trial, the full weight of his actions began to settle. He'd killed 2 people, one who'd been his wife for 14 years, another who'd been his best friend since childhood. He'd orphaned 2 children who'd called him Dad, even if they weren't biologically his. But he'd also discovered that the life he'd been fighting to protect, the family he'd sacrificed for, the love he'd believed in, none of it had been real. Every deployment, every missed birthday, every video call from a forward operating base had been in service of a lie. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple but impossible to answer. Could this tragedy have been prevented? If Linda had been honest about the affair early on, would James have been able to forgive and rebuild? If Derek had stepped back when the relationship became romantic, could the friendship have survived? If James had retired earlier, chosen family over career, would he have been present enough to prevent the betrayal? Or was this always the inevitable outcome of choices made years earlier, a tragedy set in motion the moment Linda and Derek decided to let James believe children who weren't his were his own? The trial was set for March 2024. James's defense team planned to argue for voluntary manslaughter, a crime of passion committed under extreme emotional disturbance. The prosecution pushed for first-degree murder, arguing that James had planned the confrontation by setting up the fake VA appointment. But before the trial could begin, James made one final decision that would define how this story ended. He accepted a plea agreement. March 15, 2024. The courtroom was packed with reporters, military veterans, domestic violence advocates, and curious onlookers who'd followed the case through months of media coverage. But James Holloway's trial would last exactly 17 minutes. His defense attorney, Maria Gonzalez, had spent months preparing for a complex case about betrayal, military service, and the psychological impact of discovering your entire life was built on lies. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Chen, was ready to argue that premeditation, the fake VA appointment, the careful timing made this first-degree murder. Neither side got to make their case. James stood before Judge Patricia Morrison and accepted a plea agreement, voluntary manslaughter on 2 counts, 28 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. "Your Honor," James said when asked if he understood the terms, "I understand that I took 2 lives. I understand that I destroyed a family. I understand that my actions were wrong, regardless of what led to them. I accept responsibility." Judge Morrison asked if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. James stood, looked toward the gallery where Daniel and Anita Cooper sat with their grandchildren, children who were no longer technically their grandchildren, but whom they loved anyway, and spoke for less than a minute. "I protected my country for 27 years, he said, his voice steady but hollow. "I couldn't protect my own home. The man I was died in that room too. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because what I did is unforgivable. I'm just asking that those children be allowed to heal and build lives that aren't defined by this tragedy." He sat down. The judge imposed the agreed-upon sentence. James Holloway was led away in shackles, and the courtroom emptied in stunned silence. The plea agreement meant no trial, no weeks of testimony about the affair, no detailed examination of the deception that had lasted over a decade. Some people felt cheated. They wanted to understand how this had happened, wanted to hear Linda and Derek's story told in full. But for the children, the plea was a mercy. They wouldn't have to testify about their confusion over family relationships. They wouldn't have to sit through graphic descriptions of their parents' deaths. They could begin healing without the additional trauma of a public trial. "James made the right choice," said child psychologist Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd been working with the family. "Those children have been through enough. They don't need to relive their trauma in a courtroom." The military community was divided in their response. Some veterans groups saw James as a victim of circumstances unique to military families, the long deployments, the trust required when you're serving overseas, the particular vulnerability of military marriages. "This man served his country with honor for 27 years, wrote retired Colonel Michael Torres in an op-ed. "He came home to discover that everything he'd been fighting for was a lie. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it." Others argued that military service, no matter how honorable, doesn't justify murder. "We've all faced betrayal," said Army spouse advocate Jennifer Walsh. "Most of us don't respond with violence. James Holloway made a choice, and 2 people are dead because of it." The children's fate was decided in family court. Daniel and Anita Cooper were granted full custody, despite the genetic revelation that the children weren't technically their grandchildren. The court ruled that the children's best interests were served by remaining with the people who'd been their family support system. "These children have lost enough," Judge Rebecca Martinez ruled. "They don't need to lose the grandparents who've been their stability through this crisis." James signed over all his military benefits, pension, life insurance, survivor benefits to a trust fund for the children's education and care. He refused to profit from a life that had been built on deception, even though he'd been the one deceived. The house at 2847 Oakmont Drive was sold, with proceeds going to the Children's Trust Fund. The new owners demolished it and built something completely different. The neighbors were grateful no one wanted to live next to a crime scene, a monument to shattered lives. Linda's paintings were donated to organizations that work with military families and domestic violence survivors. Her art, which had documented the psychological toll of living a double life, became educational tools for counselors and therapists. "Linda's work shows us what deception does to the human soul," said Dr. Patricia Williams, who used the paintings in her practice. She was documenting her own psychological destruction, painting her confession years before she could speak it. "If you've followed this story to its conclusion, if you've grappled with the moral complexity and the human tragedy, then you understand why these cases matter. They force us to examine our own relationships, our own capacity for both love and betrayal, our own assumptions about the people we trust most." Hit that like button if you believe these stories need to be told, and subscribe if you want to continue exploring the darkest corners of human nature with us. California State Prison, Corcoran. James Holloway, now 56 years old, teaches GED classes to inmates who never finished high school. He's quiet, respectful, the kind of prisoner guards describe as no trouble. He refuses all interview requests, declines visits from journalists, and has never spoken publicly about what happened that October night. He also refuses contact with the children, not because he doesn't love them, the psychological evaluations suggest he loves them deeply, but because he believes his presence in their lives would only cause more harm. "They need to heal," he told his attorney. "They need to build new lives that aren't defined by what I did. I won't be the reminder of their trauma." The children, now 14 and 12, are thriving under their grandparents' care. They're honor roll students, involved in sports and music, building friendships with kids who don't know their story. Their therapist reports that they're remarkably resilient, but still processing the complex trauma of their early years. They haven't visited James in prison. They haven't written letters. Their therapist says this is healthy, they're moving forward, not looking back. They remember the man who read them bedtime stories and taught them to ride bikes, Dr. Kim explains. But they also understand that he killed their mother and the man who was actually their father. That's a complexity most adults couldn't handle, let alone children. Daniel and Anita Cooper, now in their mid-70s, have become advocates for military families dealing with deployment, stress, and relationship challenges. They speak at conferences about the warning signs they missed, the conversations they wish they'd had with Linda. "We knew she was struggling," Anita says, "but we thought it was normal military wife stress. We didn't realize she was drowning in deception. Maybe if we'd asked harder questions, pushed for family counseling, been more involved, maybe this could have been prevented." The military has used this case in training programs about family support during deployments. The particular vulnerabilities of military marriages, long separations, high stress, the trust required when one spouse is serving overseas, create conditions where betrayal can flourish. This case represents a perfect storm of circumstances, explains military family counselor Dr. Robert Martinez. Extended deployments, inadequate communication, a support system that became something else entirely. It's a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of military service. The community where it happened has largely moved on. New families live in the neighborhood, children play in the same parks where James's kids once played. Life continues with the resilience that communities show after tragedy. But those who knew the family still struggle with questions that have no good answers. Could they have seen the signs? Should they have intervened? Were there moments when a different choice, a different conversation, a different decision might have changed everything? Mrs. Rodriguez, the children's former teacher, still thinks about the family dynamics she witnessed but didn't understand. "I saw Derek at every school event, every parent-teacher conference. I saw how the children lit up when he arrived. I thought it was beautiful, this family friend, who stepped up when the father was deployed. I had no idea I was watching a decade-long deception." The case has become a study in criminal justice programs, psychology courses, and military family support training. It raises questions about betrayal and justice, about the limits of human endurance, about the difference between explanation and excuse. Some people see James as a victim driven to desperate action by unthinkable betrayal. Others see him as a perpetrator who chose violence over communication, murder over divorce. Most people see him as both a man who was deeply wronged, but who responded in a way that created more victims. This story has no heroes, reflects Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic psychologist who evaluated James. Only humans who made choices, some driven by loneliness, others by betrayal, all ending in tragedy. The moral questions linger. Was Linda a victim of circumstances, a military wife struggling with loneliness and finding comfort where she could? Or was she a perpetrator of a cruel deception that robbed James of his identity as a father? Was Derek a predator who took advantage of his best friend's absence? Or was he a man who fell in love and found himself trapped in a situation that spiraled beyond his control? Was James a victim of the ultimate betrayal who snapped under psychological pressure no human should have to endure? Or was he a killer who chose violence when he could have chosen divorce, therapy, or simply walking away? The truth is probably all of these things simultaneously. Human beings are complex, contradictory creatures, capable of both profound love and devastating betrayal, sometimes within the same relationship, sometimes within the same moment. James Holloway spent 27 years defending values he believed were absolute: loyalty, honor, family. But life isn't a military operation. People aren't soldiers under command. And sometimes, the enemies that destroy us aren't on foreign battlefields, they're in our own homes, wearing familiar faces. Could this have been prevented? Perhaps. If communication had been stronger, if deployments had been shorter, if Linda had been honest, if Derek had been loyal, if James had read the signs, if any of them had made different choices at crucial moments. But tragedy doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It finds the cracks in our foundations and exploits them. 3 lives ended that October evening. 2 died in seconds. The third will spend decades dying slowly, replaying a moment that rewrote his entire past and destroyed his future. What remains is a question we must all face. How well do we really know the people we trust most? And what happens when everything we believe about our lives turns out to be a carefully constructed performance? The children are building new lives now, with new identities, new dreams, new hopes that aren't defined by the tragedy that shaped their early years. They're the only true innocence in this story, and perhaps their healing is the only redemption possible. James sits in his prison cell, teaching other inmates to read, serving his time with the same quiet discipline he brought to his military service. He's lost everything: his freedom, his family, his identity, his future. But he's also found something: the certainty that comes from accepting responsibility for your actions, even when those actions were born from pain beyond imagination. The story of the Betrayal Protocol isn't really about crime and punishment. It's about the fragility of the lives we build, the trust we place in others, and the devastating consequences when that trust is broken. It's about the fact that love and betrayal often live in the same house, sometimes in the same heart, sometimes in the same moment. And it's about the truth that the greatest betrayals aren't committed by enemies. They're committed by the people we trust most, the people we love most, the people we believe would never hurt us. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. If this story affected you, you're not alone. Thousands of you have watched this investigation unfold, processing what betrayal, loyalty, and justice really mean in the messy reality of human relationships. But here's what matters. Stories like James's, like Linda's, like those children's, they're not entertainment. They're warnings. They're lessons. They're mirrors reflecting the fragility of the lives we build and the trust we place in others. So here's what I need you to do. First, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but because stories like this need to be told. Because understanding human tragedy helps us recognize the warning signs in our own lives. Because the conversations these cases start might prevent the next tragedy. Second, leave a comment. Tell me, do you sympathize with James, with Linda, with neither? Your perspectives shape how we cover these stories, and I read every single response. Third, share this video. Someone in your life needs to see this. Maybe they're in a struggling relationship. Maybe they're military families dealing with deployment stress. Maybe they're friends getting too close to someone else's spouse. Share it. Start conversations that matter. Fourth, check the description for resources. I've linked support for military families, infidelity counseling, and crisis intervention services. If this story triggered something in you, reach out. Get help. Don't let problems fester until they explode. And finally, remember that every true crime story represents real people, real families, real devastation. Honor their story by learning from it. Next week, we're covering another case that will challenge everything you think you know about family, trust, and the secrets people keep. The notification bell ensures you don't miss it. Until then, hold your loved ones close, communicate honestly, ask the hard questions. And remember, the greatest betrayals aren't committed by strangers. They're committed by the people we trust most. I'll see you in the next story.